Hello there. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this North Yorkshire Sport Active Lives survey briefing, and more importantly, thank you for choosing us over Boris. Although I'm sure one or two of you might have your eye on what he's saying at the moment. Um, uh, I'll just start off by doing a very brief introduction of myself and my colleague who are going to deliver this little briefing to you. So I'm George Cull, I'm the Head of Development at North Yorkshire Sport, and I'm joined by my colleague Lucy Psarias, who is the Development Manager also at North Yorkshire Sport. What we're going to do today, and I hope you can all hear me and kind of please just shout up if not. Someone said hello on the chat, so that's a good sign. What we're going to kind of take you through today is an update on the most recent data release of the Active Lives Children's Survey, which actually should have come out December, but like many things was a little bit delayed due to everything that's going on in the world. But that was released in January, and what we'll take you through today is as an update really on what that data was telling us on a national level. We'll be able to delve a little bit into more how that reflects a bit more locally. We'll come on to some of the limitations of that as we go through it in terms of the local participation rates. But what we'll also be able to explore and share with you is some of the insight that we've picked up around different demographics, different types of young people, and how that has been affected over the last academic year. And also we'll look at how participation and how things that have happened have had an impact on outcomes for young people. And we'll kind of take you through all of that in hopefully in about half an hour for the length of this session. Just so you all know, this is being recorded now for a couple of reasons. First of all, in case anyone misses today, we'll record it so they can still catch up on and pick up some of the insight. But also, if you kind of want to watch it back and have a bit more time to study some of the slides and some of the stuff that sits behind it, then it'll be there for that. You probably get sent a link straight after the session, which will tell you where it's recorded. What we'll probably do is take that recording and tidy it up a little bit so you don't have this blurb that I'm giving you now, and put it on YouTube, and we'll send you that link, which is you're more than welcome to share with colleagues as well. It's not an interactive webinar in the sense of people being able to verbally ask questions, but what we do ask is as you go along, if you think of a question that you want to ask, then please do type it in the chat, and we'll pick them up. We'll try and lump them all together all at the end. There are some that we may not be able to answer. If it's about interrogating the data, we're not the data owners. We're just kind of sharing the findings of Sport England's data. So we might not be able to tell you how active a year one child is in Richmondshire, but there may be some things that we can answer for that. So please do ask the questions, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And I'm sorry if you just heard a cat meowing. That's mine just joining me in the room. So apologies for that as well. So in terms of some of the context of what the data we're going to share with you covers and what length of time it covers, it is the academic year 2019 and 2020. And part of the reason for that is that the way that Sport England and the Office for National Statistics have set the survey up is that it's to look across the entire academic year. It's not a moment in time. It runs periodically throughout that academic year, so it captures seasonal trends as well as kind of demographic type trends. But it does capture the sort of the knock-on effects of the first lockdown that we had almost a year ago now. So it does start to get some of the early insight from the first lockdown. And as I've just said, it's an official national statistic. So what's really kind of important to point out there is that this survey, particularly on a national level, it is one of the most significant things that will help inform government policy. So for us, it's very important in terms of being able to understand it, but also being able to have the survey completed locally. And Lucy will touch on that in a couple of slides' time. Linked to that, almost what the session won't cover, just so that the expectations are managed. It is pretty much all exclusively us talking about what the Active Life survey from last year has told us. So we're not blending that in with other data, and we're not cross-referencing stuff like growing up in North Yorkshire or any other tools or data collection techniques. This is a chance to kind of look exclusively at what the Active Lives Children survey is saying. I mentioned about there's some limitations around the localized data that we're not really able to drill down too far. And really, we can, the furthest we can get is to present stuff, a comparison on a North Yorkshire, a full county level. And some of that's due to the sample size and just it not being statistically reliable enough. And what we're also not going to do is guide you or tell you any answers today in terms of what to do as a result of this, or that effort should be focused on X or Y. What we hope is it prompts those thoughts and it prompts that thinking and reflection, and actually you look at it and put that into a context for you and what's relevant to the service that you work on, or the area of work that you do. And what's really pleasing for me is, having looked at the sign-up list today, we've got some colleagues from education, some teachers on here. We've got some from what I would deem more the traditional kind of sport, physical activity sector. But then we've also got a wider audience. We've got people from youth organisations. We've got people from children's services in the local authorities, and you've all got a slightly different lens that you'll probably be viewing this with. So I hope it kind of provides some food for thought for you. What I want to try and do first is just is share a little poll with you, which I'm hoping comes up on your screen now. So before you got the email about this session and it introduced you and said, Active Live survey, do you want to come to a briefing to it? Or your manager sent you this saying you need to attend this or something. So before you had this interaction about this session, had you heard of the Active Lives Children survey before? So just a yes, no, although I'm not sure many people will be not sure. You probably either have or haven't. So yeah, the answers are coming in. The poll's working. That's good. I think we've got most in. So so there's 30 in the room. We've got 26 answers. So yeah, so we're pretty much all kind of there. So we've got, and I'm not sure if you can see this on yours, but we've got 15 people who've answered saying yes, so 56% of the respondents, and 12, which is 44%, saying no, they've not heard of that. That's really useful for us to just get that kind of feel and that flavour of who's in the audience for this session. We'll give you a bit of background and a bit of context as to kind of the Active Live survey, how the data is collected. Lucy's going to kind of cover that on the next slide. But if at any point we start assuming there's some knowledge and you're not quite sure, then again, just put the comment in chat and we'll try and revisit and explain any aspects of there. I'm going to hand over to Lucy now, who is going to just cover what the Active Life survey is.
Perfect. Thanks, George. Before we delve into some of the data, we wanted to give a brief overview into the survey. So the Active Lives Children and Young People survey, commissioned by Sport England, assists to gather data nationally on how children engage with sport and physical activity, providing anyone working with children aged 5 to 16 key data to help understand children's attitudes and behaviours around sport and activity. The survey is school-based, and each term, primary and secondary schools are randomly selected to take part. This is usually carried out within a classroom setting and would usually take pupils around 15 to 20 minutes to complete. Due to the current situation with lockdown, the survey has since been adapted, and questions have been asked to reflect more of young people's feelings and behaviours more within a home setting. A lot of children at present have been taking part in this as part of their home learning from school. Due to the current period, more so than ever, we've really seen some significant changes and gaps created around sport and physical activity participation levels for certain groups of young people. This really highlights the importance around school completion of the survey, really allowing us the best possible chance to capture this data and intelligence, and in turn investing in opportunities that really do have the greatest impact. It's important to understand that this survey isn't about a judgment on a school or us going into a school to actually ask them how much activity is being delivered. It's simply an opportunity for us to really home in on where future funding might best be placed.
Okay, so now we will I'll pick a few slides and talk you through them, and then me and Lucy will do a bit of a double act for the remainder. There's a couple of people on chat who are having a couple of issues with connection and joining. I'm not a tech expert and not going to try to be whilst kind of trying to deliver this side of it. So I'm really kind of sorry to the guys who've got some tech issues. But we will record it. We will send you all the link to the recording if it doesn't work out and you can't join. So just wanted to pick that up now. Onto the data, and the slide that you've got in front of you shows the national results and the headline levels of activity. And what you'll see from the two red circles on there is essentially there's been a significant decrease in the proportion of children who are active. So we've got less active children, and active is defined as they do on average of 60 plus minutes a day. If you're talking numbers, that's about 87,000 young people up and down the country. But what's important to note is that's still a better position than what we had in the 2017-18 academic year. So whilst it has gone down from the previous year, we're still in a better position than we were 3 years ago. What that's resulted in is a significant increase in the proportion who are less active. So that's up 2.4% or 200,000 people nationally. But again, that's down on 2017-18. So we're still in a better place than we were 2 years ago. It's just worth noting at this point that the way the survey is carried out is random samples of schools, and there is an element behind the scenes of modelling that helps get to these figures and percentages around the levels of activity. Obviously, it's not a survey that covers every single young person in every single postcode. So there is kind of modelling that is done to get to these figures. So if we then just contrast that with how that looks in North Yorkshire, and what you'll essentially see for that is that we are below the national average for the number of children who meet the 60 minutes average per day chief medical officer requirements. So we are slightly underneath the national average, which I know something North Yorkshire doesn't like to be in anything. We like to be the ones who are certainly above average. But actually, our less active, the ones who do less than 30 minutes a day, highlighted in the red kind of part of the bar chart, that also is less than the national average. That's a positive thing in that where we seem to have increased in terms of numbers, where that increase has balanced out with the decreases in the number of active kids, is in those who are fairly active. So those who do something, maybe not quite enough to meet the chief medical officer requirements of 60 minutes an average a day, but they're doing something which actually is not too bad in terms of their activity levels. So the graph there just shows in terms of how North Yorkshire stacked up last year and how it's stacking up this year. So slightly below the national average for number of active young people. The next slide, I talked in the introduction about seasonality, and this is where we start to delve into the COVID impact. But actually, what we saw on a national level over the year is that activity levels were really strong in the autumn term, and had gone up by 2.9% on the previous year. So we started the academic year off well. And And then we got to spring, and I suspect not many of you will recall this time last year, last February, but we got hit by about 3 storms that really caused some serious flooding. Washed out loads of sports fixtures. Really had an impact in terms of sport and physical activity. And that reflected in the spring data, because actually if they split the spring data into the first half term and the second half term, it was still performing quite strong in the first half term. It was after half term that there was a massive drop off, and that's where the 4.1% decrease in spring comes from. We then move into the summer term, and this is where coronavirus has really started with lockdowns, with partial school closures only remaining open for key workers for part of it, but then the phased kind of return to school that some children or that many children kind of had. The actual impact in the summer wasn't as probably significant as you would potentially expect, and it's actually only down 2.3% on the previous year, the previous summer. So actually not that bleak picture in the summer. We'll come and we'll investigate that a bit more as we go through the presentation. But actually that was the kind of seasonal effect that we witnessed, and in a way the storms probably had more of an effect than necessarily coronavirus. It's important to note and just reflect back on what Lucy said around it's a school-based survey, and although it did move to some completions at home, the data collection is paused during Easter term and summer holidays and other school holidays. So the first lockdown happened, and Easter was quite early on in that lockdown, but nothing was captured over that time. It was when schools, when it was officially schools being at school, even though most kids were being homeschooled at that point. And so the next one to kind of to look at is around what that impact was on different types of activity, and probably not surprising, a number of sports saw particularly significant drops. Again, this is national, and this is just the summer term compared with the previous year's summer term, so it's like for like in terms of summer term. But we'll see significant drops in team sports, understandable because of the lockdown restrictions. Swimming, another one that's absolutely understandable. But even stuff like active play and informal activity took a drop as well. So many activities really took a hit, really went down. None of them would probably surprise us in terms of the access to the facilities or the way to take part in them was taken away from us in an instant, really. But we saw some things that picked up, some things that increased in participation levels, and again, probably not a huge amount of a surprise in terms of some of these sports, but it's useful to get a feel for the scale in which the increases were felt. So fitness as an example, throughout the pandemic, we've had Joe Wicks, we've had loads of activity that has been targeting that fitness market. And that really does reflect kind of that increase in kind of gym and fitness. Naturally, we had more people going for a walk or a bike ride. The limitations of the restrictions probably led people to that was all they could do. If that was one of the few freedoms they had to get outside, then that was what people did. And obviously functional walking, whether it's walking to school, whether it's it's using it just to get to A to B, not necessarily to say I'm going on a walk because I want to admire the scenery. It's actually functionally we've got to do that. We've got to walk to the shops, or we've got to walk to school, or whatever it is. So those were kind of some of the trends that we saw in activity, not kind of hugely surprising in there. And the last one, just for me in this section, is delving a little bit deeper into the fitness activities. And then Lucy's going to pick up on some demographic type stuff. So the left-hand side graph that you can see, and apologies, some of these are not certainly big on the screen. But the left-hand side chart shows year 1 to 2 and years 3 to 6, so primary school age group split in two. The right-hand chart splits out boys and girls amongst those in years 7 to 11, so kind of secondary school age. Secondary school age girls showed a much larger increase than boys in fitness activities. And we'll come on to this further on, but it's kind of a bit of a spoiler for you. But that massively and significantly contributed to actually secondary school age girls, particularly the older age group, their activity levels increasing in summer of 2020 versus summer of 2019. So we actually, whilst we saw lots of bad news, there was actually some really good news of what we would probably all say is some of the more traditionally kind of tougher group to engage of sort of that mid-teen girls. Actually, they were more active than they were this time the year before, and fitness was the most significant driver of that. It also is worth pointing out that the Active Life survey, as well as kind of tracking attitudes and behaviours, asks quite a few questions to establish the circumstances of a young person, and particularly in relation to affluence. And what also sits behind this data and this increase in fitness activities, those from a high family affluence score, those from those backgrounds, the kind of more affluent backgrounds, they showed the greatest percentage point increase for fitness. So actually, that was largely being driven by those in higher income families. So whilst it's great overall that cohort of girls have increased, actually that's not necessarily done much in the way of inequalities and tackling some inequalities around those on lower incomes. I'll now hand over to Lucy, who's going to cover some of the demographic stuff. So I'll disappear.
Thanks, George. So moving on to some of the demographic variations here. So from the data we've seen, overall, the activity levels have fallen for boys. This is perhaps unsurprising, given boys are highly likely to take part in organised activity, such as team sports. And while skills and drills training returned in June, organised sport didn't return until July. Additionally, boys are also very likely to take part in active play, which also saw drops during this period. The drop for boys has been driven by decreases for years 5 to 6 more notably, but also for secondary age boys. If we look at the panels down the right-hand side, we can see some suggestions for reasons in this. So if we focus on the youngest first, sorry, I know it's quite small, but I'll go through it all. We can see for the youngest years, that family influence plays a key here. So younger children are most likely to take part with their families. And as such, things like walking and cycling are more likely to have been substituted by some of that lost activity. For years 5 to 6, at this age, organised team sports become increasingly important. Also, between wanting to do things with their families and having that limited independence, this might have means that opportunities to substitute some of this activity may have therefore been lower. Moving on to looking at secondary, they too have missed key activities and team sports. But one of the main things for secondary schools is that independence. And so this might have been mitigated slightly by this, in a sense of secondary age pupils might have been able to just go off and do their own thing or actually try new things. So moving on to the girls, when looking at the picture for girls, overall, we can see that there's an increase. But this masks the fact that movement only comes from each end of the age spectrum. And if we look at this, this is for years 1 to 2 and the teenage girls. So if we focus on years 1 to 2, activity levels are seen to be up, but the magnitude needs to be caveated by lower sample sizes. And as the data is captured from parents for this age group, it means they also have more visibility to what their child is doing when not in school. So this might have affected the data in this way. Teenage girls also saw an increase, and we think this is likely to be down to choice, with fitness specifically seeing a large increase amongst this group. As noted on the slide, it is likely that choice played a key role here. Overall, this reflects that girls are more likely to take part in fitness and to go for a walk. Both these activities saw increases in numbers taking part, with girls notably driving the increase in fitness. This is additionally supported by child-wise data that showed that girls were more likely to say they were doing more activity than before lockdown. It was also found no significant difference during lockdown between enjoyment for girls and boys, whilst we usually see a significant greater proportion for boys enjoying it. So now moving on to activity levels for family affluence. Whilst activity levels did not change amongst those from the least affluent families, they remain lower than for those from the most affluent families. Those from the most affluent families saw the largest decrease in activity levels. We can see in the graphic on the right that for the most affluent families, activity levels were reduced by things like leisure centres, clubs, classes, lessons, etc., that remained unavailable during the easing restrictions phase of the pandemic. Reduced opportunity has driven the fall in activity levels for higher affluence. We'll come on to look at low affluence further, but this group are often active with parents and siblings, and walking to get to places is also important. And both were available during the pandemic. However, whilst activity levels overall are currently unchanged for lower affluent families, this really does mask a mixed picture underneath, as overall attitudes did change quite substantially. What we saw was significant drops in enjoyment, confidence, and competence. This reduced positivity raises uncertainty about future activity levels for lower affluence. So moving on to this slide, the mixed picture I was referring to is shown here. And apologies, because I know some of the writing's quite small here, but I'll talk through it. So the no change result for lower affluence is being driven by year 1 to 2 pupils, seeing a 16% increase. Year 1 to 2 pupils identified lower on the family affluence scale did more indoor activity. For years 3 to 11, lower affluence overall did see a significant decline in activity of around 6%.
Okay, I'm just waiting for my face to appear. Lucy, I'm going to talk through again just the next few slides and start to link in some of the data that's captured, which picks up some of the attitudinal type stuff, which I think is there's some real power to this, and it really helps us, I think, with some of the making the case for sport and physical activity as a sector. So Lucy's mentioned attitudes, and kind of this probably just delves a little bit deeper. So we define physical literacy as having 5 components, and this is the definition that Sport England have settled on, to have 5 components of physical literacy, and they measure and assess each one of the 5, and they're on the screen on the graph. So you've got enjoyment, confidence, competence, understanding, and knowledge. So there is a statement that is asked on each active live survey that a child completes, and assesses that how much they strongly agree, or strongly disagree, or disagree with the statement. And what they can capture is those who strongly agree with the statement, that's classed as a positive attitude. So the more positive attitudes that a child has, if they strongly agree to all 5, they will be more active. There's a positive association there. So those 5 components all being present is really powerful in terms of the link between how active someone is. So if someone doesn't enjoy an activity, or is really low on confidence on how they might perform some of the technique or skill on it, then that's going to have a serious impact, as will the other ones. this graph on the screen looks specifically at the summer term and compares it with the previous year as well. The two aspects that have really seen a drop has been the confidence and the competence, that young people are not agreeing with that as strongly as they did the previous year. Obviously, that feels quite strongly linked with the, for those who were active, having their activity taken away, feeling de-skilled, not having that time to practice, to perform whatever activity they do, so not feeling that ability to do it, or that confidence to to back themselves on it. So this is probably getting under the skin of why some of the activity levels dropped, is what was probably was there underlying in terms of affecting a young person, as well as the access to the facility or school, or not being in school where there's a structure and a timetable that gives PE and other kind of activity as well. So the physical literacy, which we kind of referred there to, which is the 5 kind of components. There is a change in physical literacy as you get older. So the left-hand side looks at enjoyment, and the question is, I enjoy taking part in exercise and sports, and then you rate how on the scale of how much you agree with that. But what we really saw is year 5 and 6 boys in particular, they showed reduced activity levels in summer of 2020, and that kind of corresponds with what we see there around they dropped in terms of both enjoyment and confidence, but also a little bit on understanding as well. But teenage girls, and we know that they've actually increased based on the previous year. Their enjoyment of physical activity and sport actually increased, and that goes hand in hand with the increase in participation levels. Enjoyment has always been the biggest component of the 5 components of physical literacy. So and it feels really obvious. It probably applies to all of us, in terms of if we enjoy something, we're more likely to do it. But this is backing that up in terms of that assertion. And in terms of the next one, this is around their positive attitudes, but they're actually lower for girls. So if we do a gender comparison, that splits the attitudes down separately for boys and girls. And we've already seen that boys have driven the drops in activity levels. And what we can kind of see from this slide is that most attitudes have dropped for boys. So it's probably not one single thing. It's probably a mix of the 5 kind of components driving that decrease in boys. And the noticeable difference, as we've said, for girls is in enjoyment, but also in knowledge of knowing what to do. And I think the sector, it felt like we really responded. Yes, we had Joe Wicks, but we also had locally driven activity by school games organisers. Schools stepped up and organised their challenges to maintain that contact with kids. There was a lot activated really swiftly. And actually, a lot of that resonated with girls, and kind of, we think one of the biggest factors in that is around research from this girl can campaign, highlights the fear of judgment being a major barrier for women and girls, and actually being able to do something in the comfort of your own home or bedroom or with no one watching. It's not in a PE class as normal. Actually, that probably is certainly some of the explanation we would attribute to that. And looking at some of these comparisons again, and picking up sort of inequalities between most affluent and least affluent families, what we see from this is those from the least affluent families are less likely to report positive attitudes to sport and exercise. So there's a clear kind of link from there. And those from the most affluent families are more likely to report positive attitudes. So there is that direct kind of contrast to make there. Those from most affluent families were more likely to show less favourable attitudes during summer term of 2020 as well. what's really concerning from us, not just from a pure sport and physical activity and hard data and hard numbers thing, is that that's suggesting the activity levels of the least affluent possibly are less resilient longer term, because sitting underneath that are the 5 components of physical literacy, and they're taking a bit of a hit. And actually, whilst that might not have had an immediate impact, it's worrying in terms of this year's collection of the data and how that has actually impacted on the least affluent families. And I will hand back over to Lucy for the next slide.
Thanks, George. So moving on now to look at individual development. When we look at individual development across the year, then there's a positive association between how active a young person is and the levels of resilience. This positive association is also stronger for those who report they are volunteered in sport and physical activity in a physical activity capacity. However, when we focus on the summer term, individual development is down for all age groups, but more notably for children in years 3 to 6 by almost 23%. The magnitude of the drop is unprecedented and has been seen across all levels of activity. The change for individual development tended to be from strongly agree to the middle 2 categories, agree or disagree. Ofsted have published a briefing on schools report in December 2020 that also highlighted that younger pupils are likely to have been more negatively affected. So if we look at years 3 to 4 boys, this showed the greatest drop for individual development, down 36%, linked with the greatest fall for happiness. Only girls in year 9 to 11 showed no change, and this was linked with activity levels.
Next one I'm gonna kind of pick up is exploring some of the outcomes a bit more, and picking on mental well-being. And as part of the survey, the people completing it are asked how happy they felt yesterday, and are asked to give a score. And what this slide really shows is that across the full year, there's a positive association between levels of engagement and levels of mental well-being. Not a huge difference, as you'll see in terms of the graph, whereas less active will give a 6.7 mean score, and active 7.1, so it's not a huge difference, but there is a step change in terms of the levels of activity and the levels of happiness. In previous years, that has been probably a little bit more emphasised. The pattern has been the same, but probably just a bit more of a gap in terms of those numbers. What we'll also introduce here is that there's also questions around volunteering and have young people done any volunteering work, either in leadership type stuff in schools or out in terms of the community. What we can also see is that there is that positive association between those who volunteer and those who haven't, and improved mental well-being. And I think that really gives us a good case in terms of the sport sector. When we're talking in the language of, yes, we're passionate about physical activity and people being physically active, but actually sometimes that language switches depending on who we're speaking to, and there may be colleagues in senior leadership team in schools who actually are looking more holistically about the mental well-being of their pupils and how they're and how happy they are before, and using that as a platform before we even talk about recovery curriculums and catch up and things like that. So for us, making that case of where being physically active can help support a happier young person. Taking that a bit further and looking specifically in the summer term and picking on girls again in secondary school. Happiness scores remained largely unchanged across years 3 to 11 between mid-May and late July compared to the same period 12 months earlier. But along with the increase in activity levels, we also saw an increase amongst girls in year 7 to 11 in terms of their happiness scores, their mental well-being. So the increases were seen across all levels of activity. So it wasn't just the more active were proportionately happier. It was all kind of levels of activity that really saw that. And really, that really reinforces that link, how important physical activity has been for that cohort of girls, and also the potential going forward, and how we may use that as we look to design future things. We're getting through to the last few there. So if you have got questions for me, and start kind of thinking about typing them out, and as we wrap up the kind of last few slides. The survey asks around loneliness, and asks about young people around how lonely they are. And this was the first time that question has been asked in the 1920 Active Lives Survey. So there's no trend data, there's no previous years to compare to. It was a new edition, but I know certainly colleagues, probably those more in youth settings, children's services, will probably be really interested in this type of data and how that links to sort of mental well-being, but also loneliness there. So there was a notable decrease for loneliness for girls, for those from least affluent families and those with a disability or long-term illness, when we got to the summer. So when we hit summer, there was a decrease in loneliness overall, which feels a bit the wrong way around when some of that time was spent with schools only partially open. But the things that drove that were those in lower income families was girls, and those with a limited illness. Some of the reason for that may have just been around the impact of spending more time with the family, whether that was forced because of the circumstances or much more optional, but actually that kind of could suggest some positive things around family engagement and family interaction, and actually young people who might be a bit more isolated from their family might have had that kind of space to reconnect. I've just seen a question come up in the chat, Julia. Yeah, it is possible to get a copy of the survey questions. We'll include that in the email out afterwards. And for those of you, I think, who are familiar with the Growing Up in North Yorkshire survey, what we've tried to do in this current round is try and get some alignment between some of the wording of some of the questions. Obviously, it's not our survey, it's North Yorkshire County Council's, but it's try and align some of the questions, so at least we're kind of going off a similar question, and we can understand some of that. Okay, and the next one to kind of pick up on loneliness is just how that links to levels of physical activity, and what we see there is, again, another positive association around those who are more active are less likely to say they're lonely, and conversely, the trend is in favour of those being more active being less lonely. So that's kind of positive. Not positive that people are reporting that they're lonely, but actually even during the summer term, that actually there was that link between levels of activity and levels of feeling lonely, which I think is kind of really important for us there. And I think this is the second last slide we've got, and what we really wanted to touch on with this is North Yorkshire being a rural county. Is there a change in terms of how that affects rural areas? I'm kind of saying I'm pleased to kind of be able to say that when Sport England have done the national kind of comparison, and they've grouped areas around urban levels of rural, the rural areas didn't really have a significant change in activity level. I think there was a slight drop, but nothing statistically to kind of cause any concern there. So actually, that really, probably something to reflect on of some of that may been a greater resilience in the rural areas and maybe affected more in more of the urban areas. So again, that's something that probably people can kind of reflect on, try to understand a bit the reasons why. But also what the slide does pick on is around IMD areas, and the most deprived areas show the greatest falls in activity level, which I don't think would surprise kind of anyone. But it reinforces that kind of bit around inequalities and those getting wider as a result of the coronavirus. And we've just kind of summarised a few of the things of almost, if you take a few things away, these are the things that probably we'll just we think are some of the key messages and key takeaways that we've certainly talked about in this presentation. Younger and older girls have actually been more active. That's kind of been a positive for them in that. Do we understand why? How much are we speaking with girls in that cohort to understand what may have changed about their habits? As I've just said, the rural areas have been quite resilient in that. What's the learning from that? What's the ingredients there that might have contributed to that? Least affluent families have been most negatively impacted, which I think we'll probably see across a number of indicators. Positive attitudes to sport and being active have decreased, which I think is a longer term a concerning thing, because I think there might not be much resilience to that, in terms of that could have a bigger negative effect as we look at this year's data. Year 3 and 4 boys drove a lot of the drops in happiness and resilience, and what quite was it about the offer, and this is national, but what was it about the offer that wasn't right, or was it just the age that they were at, and how everything else going on impacted on that. And what we also saw is that shift from team sports to individual sports, some of it out of necessity, absolutely, but actually it'd be interesting to see what the kind of longer term impact is on that, of how many people go back to team sports, how many may have found individual activities that satisfy their needs, or that they've developed a keen interest in, and that'll be interesting to see how the sports sector kind of responds to that. Those were our takeaways. You may have picked up other things, and kind of that's absolutely fine. I'll move on to the last slide of kind of give people a minute or two to digest anything there and write any questions that they've got. I'm going to try and share a handout now, if I possibly can, which is the actual survey report. So that should be coming through. There will be two documents there. You can download this from Sport England's website, so don't feel you have to download this and take it away, and you're not allowed to leave unless you've done it. But there's two reports. One is the full academic year and covers obviously some of the stuff we've picked on there. But then there will also be a second one, which I'm about to share now, and this specifically picks on the summer term of last year, so the almost the impact of the first lockdown and coronavirus. So normally they would just release one data pack, but this warranted to really delve a bit deeper into what have been the early impacts of the coronavirus. We're anticipating that if all goes well, that the next lot of data will be back to the normal release time, which is December. So we would expect that December will be when we next get the update for this current academic year that we're in. So just picking up on the questions. So Julie, I think I've answered that one around possible to get a copy of the survey questions. We'll email that out. You'll probably get an automated email through the system that we're using, but we'll send one up to everyone who's registered with a link to the video and any links to kind of useful documents. But yeah, you can get a copy of the survey questions. And Helen, thank you, really useful. Is there a summary report briefing available? Yeah, I think that's we've just shared the two there that you kind of can share with colleagues. absolutely. And if people have got the time, usually things with me end up overrunning because I like to talk a lot. But if people have got the time to watch the recording back, then obviously that might help bring it to life a little bit for them, or they might just prefer reading it. So yeah, absolutely. If there's no more questions, the last bit that I will just look to share, and I'm not sure how this will come through, but is what we'd really like to kind of get is just your thoughts. We've got launched a Typeform survey, which hopefully you'll get to click on. Some of you are clicking through now, I think, which is good. We'll send it again in the email. It's not a long one. We don't need War and Peace, but what we really like to understand is, has that resonated with you? Do you feel as us revisiting this when the next data comes out and doing something similar, is that useful for you? Is there anything that you felt was missing, or that we might want to kind of try and focus on if we did this again? But also kind of for us to get a feel of how people might use some of this. What are you thinking? What might actions be? It's not checking up on anyone, but it's just useful for us to think, as a result of doing this, what has that inspired or provoked in terms of people's thinking for stuff to do. So please, if a couple of minutes, do get a chance to fill that survey. Otherwise, I'll kind of just say thank you to Lucy for co-presenting this with me and pulling this together with us. Thanks to you guys for joining in, asking the questions that you did. And enjoy the rest of your Monday and take care. And if you do need to contact us about anything, want to follow up on anything, then please do come to us at North Yorkshire Sport, and we'll happily have conversations with you. Thank you all. Take care.